Hi friends, I hope you're all doing well. I'm so glad to be able to share this spiritual practice with you. As we begin, I invite you to get comfortable. Take a moment to feel your groundedness on the earth, the life flowing into you through your breath, and the awareness in your own consciousness. Relax, still your body and mind, and open yourself to Spirit in whatever way is helpful for you. Feel free to pause the video until you feel ready to dive into the work of today's practice. And then when you're ready, invite images into your mind of the world as you see it now. Don't try to control or judge those images. Just let them flow into your awareness. Note them for a moment, and then release them to make space for the next image. When you feel that you've done this enough, take a few moments to collate your images into a one-sentence story that reflects how you feel about the world now. You can write the story down in your journal or on your phone, or you can just let the words flow through you. But once again, don't judge. Don't judge your story. Don't try to fit it into any external standard to which you may be tempted to conform. Just allow the story to emerge. And then when you've got your one-sentence story in front of yourself, ask yourself what you would want to change about your story of the world. Where do you fit into the story? What impact does the story have on your life? And what would you prefer to be different? Sit with your thoughts and feelings for a moment, and then invite the Divine Spirit to ignite your imagination as we begin to explore what a different story might look like. And this prayer may be helpful to you. Spirit of God, fill my eyes with a vision of your dream for my world. Fill my mind with the wisdom to see how that dream may become a reality. And fill my being with the courage and strength to do what it takes to live in your country, even as I live in the ordinary world. So may it be. You know, pretty much since I first came to faith over 40 years ago, I've heard Christians declaring with great confidence that Jesus is going to return soon, meaning in our lifetimes. And at the start of my faith journey, I believed it. I watched the movie Thief in the Night as a teenager. I read books about the rapture and the second coming of Jesus, and I was convinced for a while that these were true representations of what the Bible taught. In the youth group and churches of which I was a part, it was commonplace to declare that we were living in the last days. And I was so convinced that I even wrote songs about the second coming of Jesus. Now, I've realized that these teachings weren't actually wrong. They just interpreted what they were saying in a very different way from what I now believe the biblical writers intended. In short, I believe that we are living in the last days. We just need to be very clear about what that means. Which brings us back to our conversation about the Old Testament and that prophetic phrase, the day of the Lord. The Gospel of Mark describes Jesus' very first sermon in just a few words. The Common English Bible translates his words like this: "Now is the time. Here comes God's kingdom. Change your hearts and lives and trust this good news." That first sentence, "Now is the time," is important. It's another way of saying that the time the prophets predicted had arrived. We know that this is what Jesus meant because of what happened after Jesus was transfigured. As Jesus and Peter and James and John came down from the mountain after their vision of Jesus being transformed into glory, Peter remembered what he'd been taught by his religious teachers, that Elijah would return before the Messiah appeared. Now, having seen his vision on the mountain, Peter was convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. So where was Elijah? He asked. Jesus replied that Elijah had appeared. And the gospel writers helpfully tell us that Jesus was referring to John the Baptizer. Which means that in the minds of Jesus and the gospel writers, the last days began when John the Baptizer started preaching. And we've been living in the last days, or the days of the Messiah, ever since. So when Jesus said, "Now is the time," he meant that the day of the Lord, that prophetic vision, had come. The dream the prophets spoke of a new world ushered in by God's Messiah, was now happening before the eyes of the people in Jesus' day. Now let's fast forward in the Gospels to not long before Jesus' death. As he and the disciples were walking out of the temple, the disciples commented on how beautiful the temple was. And Jesus, being a keen observer of his time, saw that Jewish frustration would boil over eventually and rebellion would break out. And he knew that if that happened, then Rome would respond swiftly and violently. And so he adopted prophetic, apocalyptic language, meaning the language of symbolism and metaphor, to describe to the disciples how the temple would be destroyed, how not one stone would be left standing on another, and how Jerusalem would face that same kind of destruction. But he also pointed out that his followers would need to learn to see that God's reign was not about a conflict with Rome. It was not about who was in charge of the nation. It was about how his followers lived regardless of what was happening in the nation. And so, like an Old Testament prophet, he referred to that day, using that phrase, that day, as a day of destruction that was simultaneously a day when God's grace and love would be revealed. Because times of suffering are always also the times when courage, compassion, and connection are seen most powerfully. That day of suffering always goes along with that day of healing and restoration. And so Jesus called his followers to receive from God the courage and the wisdom that they would need to navigate those tough times, the destruction that Jesus knew was coming. He called on them to believe that the way of Christ that he had taught them remained what they believed was the best way to live. He challenged them to believe that they could live and experience God's reign regardless of what was happening in their history. And he encouraged them to believe that the values and priorities that he taught them would outlast the violence and destruction of that time. As Leonard Sweet put it in his book entitled So Beautiful, Christians defeated the most powerful empire that ever strode the earth, not by violence, but by love. It took 3 centuries to defeat the Roman enemy, but love always wins in the end. We're living in that day right now in our world. The pandemic is a time of suffering, of conflict and destruction. Not that different from the one that provoked the prophets to imagine a different kind of day. Not that different from the kind of day that provoked Jesus to encourage his followers to stay courageous and loving. We all in our own lives have those days when it seems like God's values and priorities are completely ridiculous. When sometimes we wonder if it's even worth living. But that's why we need to remember that we are living in the last days, the days of the Messiah. We live in the era when Christ has revealed that love and justice heal the world, and it is possible to live with kindness, grace, and peace, even in a violent and divided world. In those days, our toughest, most painful times, we can remember that we do not have to be defined by the pain. We can embrace values and priorities that will sustain us through the struggle. And we can remember that the time will come when we experience that day, the time of grace, peace, connection, and well-being that the prophets spoke of and that Jesus said had arrived with him. We just have to hold on to the hope and trust that in the end, life always transforms death and love always wins. What kind of that day of pain and struggle are you navigating right now? And what that day of hope are you waiting for? How can remembering that we live in the last days in which Christ has revealed the path of peace and love help you to navigate your turmoil and hold on to hope? In the next chapter, we will explore in more detail what it means to live in the last days and what it means to be saved so that we can live in the reign of God, even now. Return to that space of groundedness and stillness that you were in at the start of this practice. Allow a few moments for this reflection to sink into your heart, and take note of anything that stood out for you, that challenged you or inspired you. Now go back to the story you wrote in the beginning of this practice. Compare it to the dream that we've just been talking about. And now I encourage you to write another story about the world. This time, make it a little longer, maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, and describe the world as you would like it to be. Keep in mind how you see the world now as expressed in the short story you wrote earlier, and also keep in mind the dream that we've explored in today's reflection. And try to make this new story that you're writing now realistic and practical, but also hopeful and filled with possibilities. And again, you can pause the video if you need a while to do this. And when you're done writing your new story about the world, make sure to keep it somewhere close to you so that you can return to it throughout the week, so that you can allow it to fill your heart and mind with its inspiration. And now, as we prepare to return to the practical details of living, take a moment to identify one thing you can do to live as if your hopeful story of the world was a reality now. Think of one thing that can move you a little closer to making this dream real for you, and commit to doing that thing as consistently as you can through the week. See yourself living in this new world of your story. Imagine making the habits and feelings and attitudes of your story the way you actually live now, even though your world, the one you're really in right now, may be very different from the one you've been imagining. And now go into your week to live in God's country, even as you live in our ordinary world.